is Veterans Day, also internationally known as Armistice Day. And in that vein, I'm very pleased to introduce my wonderful colleague, Dr. Frank Blazich, who's a curator of military history at my own Smithsonian home, National Museum of American History. He's also an Air Force veteran. And I know we have several veterans in the audience, so I just want to thank you all for your service, past, present, and potentially future. Thank you. So Frank specializes in the American military experience in the 20th century. He earned his PhD in modern American history from The Ohio State University. Before coming to the Smithsonian, Frank served as a historian at the U.S. Navy Seabee Museum in California, then moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as a historian at the Naval History and Heritage Command, and as the historian on Task Force Netted Navy, working for the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. He lives in Northern Virginia with his wife, Nicole, and son, William. Frank's first edited book is Bataan Survivor, a POW's account of Japanese captivity in World War II. And his second book is An Honorable Place in American Air Power, Civil Air Patrol Coastal Patrol Operations, 1943. He's also widely published other articles and blog posts and gives numerous public talks. Even just this week, as you can imagine, for Veterans Day, he's been in high demand. So we're very fortunate that he could join us today. We're also lucky to hear some research that he's been able to do recently based on a collection he brought into the museum, as he shares the fascinating story of an American captain in the French Foreign Legion during World War II. So with that little intriguing hint, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Blazich.
Thank you for the kind invitation to dine and speak with you here today. As a curator of modern military history at the National Museum of American History, I work with a collection of approximately 250,000 artifacts. And as one could expect, there are a lot of stories and lives connected to these military treasures. In storage, we have the uniform and papers of one remarkable American's fight for freedom and democracy, and this practically begs for a Hollywood treatment. And this is his story. John Freeman Jack Hasey was born in Brockton, Massachusetts on November 3rd, 1916, to the son of Fred and Ellen. And at age 3, his family moved to Bridgewater. Now, his father was the executive vice president of the George E. Keefe Shoe Company, advertisement seen here. And he ensured that his sons Jack and his older brother Dick grew up in relative comfort, and they also had an education to make them physically, mentally, and intellectually strong. His father at one point hired a professional boxer to come in to teach his sons how to defend themselves. In 1929, at age 11, Jack found himself touring Scotland, Holland, England, and France. His mother then rented an apartment in France, and he and his brother took lessons in French. They toured the countryside. They indulged in athletics and made friends with other European boys of their age. He then returned to Bridgewater as a young teenager, but was a wee bit more interested in athletics than academics. So while he did not do well academically, the family sent him back to France, and he actually ended up spending a summer in Biarritz to further improve his French. Now, arriving back in the United States in fall 1934, he transferred to Worcester Academy, finally buckled down on his academics, and managed to graduate. And thereafter, he entered Columbia University in September 1936. As a freshman, he pledged to Delta Epsilon fraternity, and he took to New York City with glee. Quote, "Before that year was out, I think I can truthfully say that I knew every nightclub doorman and head waiter in New York. But then, when the term ended, I thought it might be just as well for me to be on the high seas when my marks got home." So he then booked passage on the French liner Normandy, and he sailed for France. His argument to his family was he wanted to finally master the French language. He thought he could continue his education at the Sorbonne. But once he arrived in Paris, let's just say education fell out of his mind, and he went back to hanging out with his friends and having a good time. So basically, what does he do about money? He's in Paris. Now, he has adequate means, but the Depression at this point has also hit France hard. Hasey spoke poor French. He lacked a worker's card. But he then learned about an advertisement with the renowned jewelry firm Cartier, and they were looking to hire either an American or a British salesman to work between Paris and Monte Carlo. Tough work. The ideal candidate spoke perfect English, was young, personable, able to wear a proper evening dress, and well-connected. Suffice to say, he had a job in a week. And in that week, he then was on his way to Monte Carlo with $3 million worth of jewelry in his personal possession, destined for the store vaults in the city. He took to this job like a duck to water. While apprenticing to become a professional jewelry salesman, he wore tails during the evening hours. He made himself seen in the right clubs and cocktail rooms, and he built up his social connections. But his real specialty came in selling to Americans who preferred direct sales rather than a courtship, which was more of Cartier's style. And his growing success resulted in securing ever more famous clients, including Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Marlene Dietrich, and yes, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, although he noted they didn't really have a lot of money at that point. Wondered, funny how these things work when you abdicate. But he then further developed a sales technique for the gaming tables at Monte Carlo to boost his commission. So Hasey would wear a fine dinner jacket and he would find the gambler who was on the hot streak, who typically had a female companion. At that point, he would display some of his glittering wares, and the gambler, flush with money and not wanting to either disappoint his companion or the bystanders, would make a purchase of a necklace or a bracelet. But this forced Cartier to develop a new policy, all sales final, no returns the morning after. But while he is surrounded by this glamour of Monte Carlo or Paris, he could not help but witness firsthand the growing clouds of war. Uniforms were replacing civilian attire in the streets. In his words, quote, "Except for uniformed men, Paris seemed to be filled with old men and children and a few Americans." He wanted to do his part, and he attempted to join the French Foreign Legion, but once he arrived at training camp, he was informed that due to American neutrality laws, he was barred from combat units, and essentially discouraged, he went back to Paris. But once back in Paris, he met up with Steel Powers, who was a fellow American and the son of the late American director of Coca-Cola in Germany, and they met at Harry's bar in New York, Harry's New York bar there in Paris. And together, the two men pooled their resources, sold off whatever they could to raise funds, and recruited fellow Yanks for what would become the non-combatant Iroquois Ambulance Corps. Hasey became their secretary and Powers the technical advisor. They were based at the luxurious Chateau de la Rance at Villa de Frey outside of Paris, and they eventually numbered about 40 members and organized themselves as a military-like organization. And Cartier itself actually designed the insignia for the Corps, the silver-plated Iroquois Indian head, and this is much akin to the famed insignia of the Lafayette Escadrille. They were able then to secure 2 ambulances with the aid of the American Volunteer Ambulance Corps, or AVAC. And with the Soviet invasion of Finland in late 1939, there was an opportunity here for the Iroquois group to, quote, get into the war. The Finnish government agreed to take on 2 ambulances as an experiment, but the Iroquois Ambulance Corps found itself subsumed into the AVAC, which then used the Finland expedition as basically a publicity opportunity to raise its profile. Hasey would lead this exhibition to Finland, and it consisted of 2 ambulances and 3 other men. They sailed for Finland via Norway and Sweden and arrived in December. In Hasey's words, within 24 hours of arriving in Malmö, quote, "We found ourselves fighting a war by rushing from one cocktail lounge to another. War is hell." Now, the ambulances arrived on January 5th, 1940. The men painted them white, put on white outer camouflage, and entered the war. They trained with Finnish ambulance drivers and tried to pick up basic phrases for working with the sick and wounded. Operating in the Lake Ladoga area, the 4 Americans found themselves dodging both Soviet foot patrols as well as air attacks, while also trying to avoid getting shot by trigger-happy Finnish forces. The cold here was intense. At one point, it dropped below 50 degrees below zero, which tested the survival of both man and machine. At one point, when Hasey was trying to start his vehicle, his feet froze, and he lost his toenails permanently for the rest of his life. Now, back in the United States, the press wondered, well, what happened to these 4 men and the whereabouts of the lost Corps? And finally, word reached back that everyone was safe, albeit very cold, in February. But a week after that, Soviet aircraft were bombing Finnish rail lines and preventing a hospital train from reaching the railhead where the ambulances were dropping off the wounded. Near sunset one evening, while trying to get his frozen ambulance started, a Soviet plane zoomed overhead and dropped a bomb. And immediately thereafter, Hasey felt pain in his right arm, and he found it broken into places, literally by a piece of permafrost that had been flung up and hit him in the arm. Without any anesthesia, a Finnish surgeon made splints out of captured Soviet medical supplies. And AVAC then swiftly sent Hasey back to America to speak about the efforts in Finland, and this was again to help raise money for more ambulances and more resources. So uniformed, his arm in a sling, the young man from Bridgewater found himself in demand as a hero. He had tea with Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House. He had lunch with the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he had cocktails with the Finnish and French ambassadors. Everything, quite frankly, seemed great until the German army invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands on May 10, 1940. So with the Germans advancing rapidly, Hasey fought about France. And through the aid of his vast personal network, he secured passage on a Pan American Airways Clipper, and he flew out from LaGuardia Field on June 15th, bound for Portugal. He arrived on the 17th. The news from France at this point was quite bleak, but nonetheless, he pressed ahead. Crossed the Spanish border around June 18th, made his way by rail to the city of Biarritz in southern France, just across the border from Spain. At this point, the refugees are everywhere. French morale is broken. He finally makes his way to Bordeaux, and the situation was even bleaker as France signed an armistice with the Germans on June 22nd. And by the 27th, the German troops had actually reached Biarritz. But after only a few days of watching the German occupiers, he said, that's it. I got to get into uniform. I got to do something. He leaves Biarritz on July 3rd. He makes his way across the Spanish border back to Lisbon, Portugal, but he goes to the British embassy, not the American embassy, because he's securing a visa for England. He does that on July 5th. While all the other Americans are taking passage home, he boards a small cargo ship and begins the slow journey to the British Isles. Mind you, this is a slow journey with German U-boats still operational. Arriving in Swansea on August 5th, he will soon make his way back to London. And there he contacts Etienne Bellinger, seen here, who's the chairman of the board of quartiers in London. And he asked to meet with Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle, whom Hasey had learned about from Free French movement publications and radio announcements back in southern France. Now, Bellinger was a friend of de Gaulle and actually had been supporting the general and his family ever since he had fled from France to England, and de Gaulle essentially was setting up the Free French movement in Cartier's offices there in London. So Bellinger, suffice to say, said, happy to arrange a meeting between you all. And on the evening of August 9th, Hasey will dine with General and Mrs. de Gaulle, as well as Bellinger and his wife. And over dinner, Hasey is listening with rapt attention as the general spoke of the Free French movement. As he remembered, quote, he was honest and straightforward, his confidence in the French soldier still unshaken. He saw the Free French as crusaders in the armies of democracies, certain that one day they would free his native land. He did not try to proselytize or sell me on the Free French movement. He did not ask for aid or assistance of any kind. And once the general and his wife had left, Hasey turned to Bellinger and said, how do I join up? And so the next day, the young American was in the Free French headquarters, and he found himself accepted as a second lieutenant in the transport section of the French Foreign Legion. In a telegram to his family 3 days later, Hasey simply stated, quote, was commanding a motorized section Foreign Legion. He had his AVAC uniform altered to match that of the Free French service, and he became the first American officer in the 13th Demi Brigade of the French Foreign Legion. Now, as for training, he had just over 2 weeks to prepare before the brigade received orders on August 29th to ship out. So together with the Royal Navy and Free French Navy escorts, a convoy set sail from Liverpool bound for Africa. On September 23rd, they'll arrive off Dakar. They are attempting actually to get the port to freely surrender from Vichy French forces. Unfortunately, they're unsuccessful, and they'll move further south where the brigade disembarks in equatorial French Africa. They will fight in the Battle of Gabon, and that results in the liberation of the colony and capital of Libreville from the Vichy. And by early January 41, Hasey's getting bored with the motor transport section. He says, I want to be an infantryman. So after a unanimous vote of approval by all his fellow Foreign Legion officers, he will now be assigned to this as platoon commander of the 2nd Company, 1st Battalion. And on February 12th, 1941, the brigade will arrive at Port Sudan. After weeks of salt spray, the Legionnaires are now confronted with weeks of blowing sand. Within days of disembarking, they will enter combat against fascist Italian forces. And Hasey and his 40 men will take part in the Battle of Keren. Despite thirst and increasing number of wounded, the French will advance against the deteriorating Italian forces. They will seize Keren before advancing on the prize of Massawa, which is the chief port of Italian Eritrea. And in early April, Hasey will lead his platoon forward to scout out the approaches to Fort Victor Emmanuel, and they'll manage to capture over 100 Italians by surprise. On April 8th, the overall Free French and British forces will launch a massive combined assault on the fort. Hasey's platoon is in the lead. They're one of the first inside the fortifications, and they'll manage to capture another 300 Italian prisoners. And by day's end, Massawa had fallen. And this was the main Italian port there, essentially in Italian Eritrea. So it's a major defeat for the Italians, and actually one of the first victories of the Allies in World War II in Europe. They were in Africa. Well, at this point, flush with victory, the Legionnaires rested, celebrated, buried their dead, drank a lot, and treated their wounded. On May 2nd, then, they'll board transports and sail through the Suez Canal for operations in Palestine. On leave, Hasey will visit Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as you can see here, before the Legionnaires receive orders for Syria. The mission for the 13th Demi Brigade would be to move swiftly to seize Damascus, positioning the Allies in a strategic position to defend the oil fields of Iraq and the eastern flank of the Suez Canal. Remember, the forces of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel are now moving across North Africa. They're threatening Egypt, and the Allies are fearing they're going to lose the oil fields in the Middle East. But on the morning of June 20th, Hasey and his platoon were 8 miles from the outside of Damascus, fighting through endless machine gun nests on hills flanking the road to the city. And in the lead of his platoon, Hasey crept forward and he prepared to charge a hill. In his words, quote, as I crouched, rushing forward, the machine gun on the second hill rattled. I felt a numbness in my throat and chest, a peculiar sensation of being pushed back while going forward, and I dropped for protection, but too late. One machine gun bullet had actually hit him in the left chest. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the entry exit there. He also then had a second bullet hit him in his right hand and leave a hole extending from the little finger to the thumb. Another bullet hit him in the throat, notably the larynx. It probably exited out here through his jaw. That left his chin shattered and his jaw unhinged. His Batman found him, walked him back to his commanding officer. There was no stretcher. He walked back. At that point, his commanding officer tied his chin in place with a handkerchief, and they sent him to an aid station where he walked again. At that point, a surgeon said, we need to do a tracheotomy, and they inserted a tube into his neck, but unable to talk, Hasey's writing everything on pieces of paper. He is fully conscious during the operation. He insists on holding the instruments himself to aid the surgeon, and there is no anesthesia. But then to allow him to eat, they decide to insert a gastronomy tube into his stomach, again without anesthesia. At this point, the badly wounded American will end up in a military hospital in Jerusalem, run by Scottish surgeons, and there a British surgeon will replace the roof of his mouth. They'll begin to reconstruct his chin and remove the pipe from his neck. They replace it with a metal valve, which you can see there. This allows him to speak with a whisper. It's while he's here in the hospital that he'll receive the Croix de Guerre with Silver Star for his bravery at the Battle of Keren. But then on October 19th, in Damascus long having been secured, Hasey is summoned from the hospital for a more prestigious award ceremony. Before the ranks of his fellow legionnaires and cheering Syrians, General Georges Curator, commanding the Free French forces in Syria, will present Hasey with the Croix de Guerre with Palm for bravery in the Battle of Engahat on March 15th, and the far more prestigious Order of Liberation, which is Free France's highest decoration. In a letter to Hasey from General de Gaulle, quote, just as you were the first American citizen to shed his blood to free France from the oppressors, so I wish you to be the first American citizen to become a companion of the Order of Liberation. Hasey would be one of only 4 Americans to receive this order, and there are only 1,038 ever recipients of this order. It is a closed order. On October 30th, he is transferred to the British General Hospital in Jerusalem then for additional plastic surgery on the neck wound. And there they're able to basically pull the skin together to cover the hole, remove the pipe, although he has very severe scarring. And once he's healed, he's able to travel back to the United States in late November of 41. So from Beirut, he will fly to Cairo, then to Khartoum, Lagos and Natal, Belém, Trinidad, San Juan, Cuba, Miami, and finally New York. And he arrives home on January 13th, 1942, to America at war. He is already now a 2-war veteran, and he appears 2 days later before his local draft board in his French Foreign Legion uniform to register under selective service. Unsurprisingly, his wounds from Damascus result in him being declared 4F, not qualified for military service, 5 days later. At this point, he's unable to serve in the United States military, so he will remain the only American holding a commission in the French Foreign Legion throughout World War II. In March and April, he will spend several weeks at Massachusetts General Hospital, where Dr. Verestad Kazanjan, who is the founder of modern plastic surgery, will rebuild his damaged face. They take a piece of bone from his hip that will form the basis for a new jaw and chin. Skin from his chest will then be grafted onto his face and neck. The inside of his mouth is rebuilt with skin grafts from underside his arm. And I don't know if you can see, but where the face is sunken in here, you can see they kind of rebuilt a somewhat more natural appearance. And this is in 1942, medical technology. It's really remarkable. In the ensuing weeks, he will begin to recover his ability to speak, but he'll always have a hoarse, gravelly voice. For those out there who like Google, you can Google Jack Hasey, and there's an NPR recording of him. Prior to his death, you can actually hear his voice. So if his medical operation is successful, he will begin to return to service. He becomes a trainer of new French Foreign Legion personnel outside of New Orleans. His autobiography, Yankee Fighter, was published in August of 1942 and received very popular reviews and additional demands for speaking engagements. He will arguably become the American face of the Free French movement, and he is an ardent supporter of General de Gaulle and the cause of French freedom. And in early 1943, he will become a speaker for the American Red Cross's War Fund campaign, traveling around the East Coast. That February, his story is featured prominently in the newest issue of Real Heroes comic books. There you go. And his draft board will also curiously reclassify him as, quote, a member of the Armed Forces of the United States. And this gives him permission to depart the United States indefinitely, and according to his papers, for, quote, confidential business. So that July, he will join his brigade in Algeria and will be assigned as aide-de-camp on the staff of General Marie-Pierre Koenig, seen here on the left. Hasey will be promoted to captain on August 15th, 1943, and he will then join Koenig in London, when the general is tasked by de Gaulle to command all French resistance forces. Koenig will then thereafter become the Free French delegate to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces commanded by General Dwight David Eisenhower. And in this capacity, as Koenig's aide and as an American citizen, Hasey will become acquainted with General Eisenhower. And the records here are a bit fishy, but it appears that he was a back channel between the American and the French commanders. Following the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, Koenig will receive command of the French forces of the interior, and these are aiming to unify all French resistant groups under de Gaulle's command. On August 21st, de Gaulle will name Koenig as the military governor of Paris. When French forces then begin to enter Paris, Hasey is the first American into the once occupied capital. For the remainder of the war, he will stay on Koenig's staff in Paris. You can actually see his pass there at the top. And in January 1945, he will become a Chevalier in the Legion of Honor. So honorably discharged from the French Foreign Legion on December 19th, 1945, he returns home to Bridgewater. He'll return to Cartier as a salesman, and he works between Paris and New York. But peacetime is a bit boring after everything he's experienced. One day while selling jewelry to Mamie Eisenhower in 1949, he reconnects with the general. And Ike hears him and saying, I'm kind of bored, General, with this job. He says, well, you might be interested in a new organization, the Central Intelligence Agency. Hasey will then join the agency in 1950. His first assignment is back to Paris, and he's assisting General de Gaulle in writing his memoirs. Really, he's just keeping Washington informed of what de Gaulle's up to. Throughout the 1950s, then, Hasey will continue to serve as a clandestine back channel between later President Eisenhower and President de Gaulle. But eventually, Hasey's clandestine service will place him in a total of 17 countries in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Exactly what he did remains highly classified to this day, but we can say that he was likely involved in a regime change or two by less than democratic means. He will retire from the agency in 1974, having risen to become a station chief and senior operations officer. He will then spend the remaining decades enjoying gardening in Arlington and staying in touch with his beloved Legion. He also returns to France several times, notably in 1996, when President Jacques Chirac will elevate Hasey to the rank of officer in the Legion of Honor. He passes away in 2005, age 88. His tombstone is, quite frankly, the only one I know of in the United States, which reads Captain, French Foreign Legion. So I thank you all for your time and attention. Now, right now, we have several hundred Americans fighting in uniform in Ukraine for Ukraine. Like Hasey, these men and women are fighting for freedom and democracy. So this Friday, let us honor and celebrate all American men and women who serve both our nation and our allies, upholding the ideals that we hold so dear: liberty, equality, freedom, and justice. Thank you all very much.
It sounds like he never had a family.
He did, actually. He was married to a French woman. I know he married her on March 15th, 1945. I don't know then what happened, because in 1953, he married an English woman. And I'm being honest, I don't know what happened. But he did have a son. His son, Richard, ended up serving in the United States Marine Corps. His first assignment was to Beirut in 1983. Some of his men were killed in the barracks bombing. And I collected his uniform because it's the only American I have connected to the detonation of the barracks there in Beirut in 1983. The family actually has military service going back to about the 1700s. His one uncle was killed in World War I and is buried there in France to this day.
Really enjoyed the presentation. Fantastic history. Short question. The tombstone, is that Arlington?
It is in Arlington, yeah. Not at Arlington National Cemetery, but at a cemetery in Arlington, in public cemetery. Yeah.
I just took a tour of the World War II Museum in New Orleans.
Yes, sir.
It's an amazing place. It was almost too much, I thought. And it's a little disconnected in terms of trying, it seemed like it tried to present pretty much almost every day of the war. And I just wonder, with your role at Smithsonian, how do you pick and choose what you put on display?
To put this in very simple terms, our current exhibition, The Price of Freedom Americans at War, opened in 2004 when I was getting my undergraduate degree. So I had no control over it. So that exhibit, though, is designed around four major conflicts that influenced the United States. So the American Revolution, the American Civil War, the Second World War, and the Vietnam War. Now, naturally, if one was to update it, the war on terrorism should be the fifth conflict. That exhibit is slated to go down in 2026, and about 2030, we're going to be able to put up a new exhibit. And exactly what you say, how do you try to educate your visitors while not overwhelming your visitors with either artifacts or chronology? And that is sort of why they took this approach with four main conflicts, and World War I is crammed like into one little display case. So then you have the challenge of, are you being comprehensive enough? And are you contextualizing all those aspects that you wish to contextualize? It's really a kind of a delicate dance and balance between certain, you don't want to overwhelm your visitors, but you also want to educate your visitors. Plus you have to try and grasp what education are they bringing in? How familiar are they with a given topic? So that can also limit what you put on display. I don't want to use that phrase dumbing down. It's not about dumbing down. It's about making sure that you connect with a visitor and that they can then follow. And that's why we work with educators and we work with other experts in the scripting process and in the artifact selection process. Because it's easy to say, here's one of everything. It's another to say, well, this is an object connected to an individual story. You saw Captain Hasey's kepi, the famed kepi of the Foreign Legion. That was an object that was actually on display. In fact, once I brought it in the museum, I had a curator go, "You have what?" "Mine." Yoink. And they grabbed it and they put it on display because it connects to an individual, but it connects to a broader story. In this case, the exhibit was about the American-French relationship during the Revolution to the present day. And so that's where, when I said I have 250,000 artifacts to work from, it keeps you busy because you're trying to understand what do we have and what is that one piece that speaks to as wide an audience as possible without confusing or overwhelming them. So that's a lot of words that I've just blinded you with, but I hope that helps.
I'm going to make my question short, but how do we catalog and to follow a war that we're watching in real time? It's never been done before. And this is, the war in the Ukraine. You talked about the numbers of Americans that are fighting in, their own foreign legion over there. But how do we follow them? Do we follow the whole war? Because America, in a sense, is at war and we're not declaring it, just like Russia's not declaring it.
There actually are instances where, yes, the war is being actively collected. The United States Army's Center of Military History has trained history professionals who are out gathering real time, both artifacts as well as oral histories, as well as documents. The US Navy had such a body and they disestablished it. The Marine Corps does have a similar effort where they're, and in fact, if anyone's here visited the new museum at Fort Belvoir, the National Museum of the United States Army, you can go there and you can see artifacts right out on display, even from the evacuation from Afghanistan. So they're able to bring in new material very quickly. Smithsonian is a wee bit more cumbersome, and we're not quite able to do that. On the issue of Ukraine, I've petitioned and asked saying, can I go to Kyiv? I was told no. I don't know why, but I asked. So instead, I have as a curator to go to on my own volition to try and find people. And the power of social media is you can connect directly with people. So I start to build networks and say, this is what I want. If I can't go, can you acquire this for me? Can you save this for me? This is relevant. And so I've been trying to acquire artifacts and documents related to this Ukrainian Foreign Legion and those Americans who are serving in it. Similarly, I was able to acquire objects from the evacuation from our embassy in Kabul. And I got artifacts from one of the Americans who was literally there when the flag came down and was one of the last Americans to leave. But it is a challenge, and the Smithsonian is unfortunately not always as nimble as we would like to be. On a contemporary domestic matter, I was the curator who went out on January 7th, 2021 to collect the events of January 6th on the National Mall. And so I went out that morning and walked up and down the mall for about 3.5 hours, picking up about 90 discarded objects, protest signs, leaflets, a personal defense weapon, which someone had tossed in the trash, and other bits and pieces to kind of catalog, if you will, the zeitgeist of those individuals of the previous day. And if it wasn't for that, outside of what was acquired by the architect of the Capitol, there wouldn't be anything. The FBI, who were very happy to see what we had, made a point of saying this is the largest collection of artifacts of material outside of what the Capitol has itself, because all that material is ephemeral. And battlefields in particular, as conflict moves on, people scavenge the battlefield. They recover equipment, they're repurposing swords into plowshares, so to speak. eBay right now is fantastic. You can go on eBay and you can find war trophies, if you will, that Ukrainians are actively selling to essentially funnel that money back into the conflict. And so as a curator, you don't ideally want those objects because they're removed, the provenance, they're removed from their place, but it provides a perspective on how quickly, I don't want to say crime scene, but the area of event can be transformed and the material culture of that particular event can change. So I hope that helps. I hope that helps. Thank you. I don't know.
On behalf of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C., I am pleased and proud to present you in recognition of your appearance before us. It's Trees for the Capital certificate, signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor to improve and beautify the environment. And actually, last week, our speaker wanted his GPS coordinates and I went online and they are there. So you will get to see where your tree is once we planted.
Yay.
So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I take your picture?
Oh, yes. Yeah.